Good afternoon. I'm glad you can take some time to devote to worship this weekend. It is continuously fascinating to me how much small things done again and again and again can add up to make significant and real changes. First time I walked into a room for physical therapy, I didn't know what to expect. But I didn't expect to be given such small things to do. I was in physical therapy because my right shoulder had decided that it didn't want to work anymore. And so I went into physical therapy and was given a band and hook up this rubber band, this long rubber band, and just go like this again and again and again. This is the most simple of motions. And that's what I kept on doing. And it was clear that that's what was the wisdom of how to handle this injury, how to handle being healed. And it was very clear that there was no skipping ahead. There was no getting ahead in the steps, right? That I couldn't just say, you know what, I'm just going to try something harder. I'm just going to jump ahead. Before my shoulder started to hurt, I used to be able to take Sophia and Fletcher and we'd flip them upside down and put them up on the ceiling and they would walk on the ceiling, and terrified Olivia, and the kids squealed and squirmed, that was not something I could jump ahead and do. And now I can lift them again, but it took a lot of doing this very simple exercise again and again, and there's a few stretches, and it added up. Small things done again and again add up, and they are they're healing, right? They're good for me. And there's some of those things I'm still doing to this day to stay healthy, to continue to build strength. I know that I've said it before, and I think it's worth pondering on a regular basis, that this being healthy is one way of thinking about salvation. It's a really important way. The verb for to save, sozo in Greek, is the same verb for what a doctor does when a doctor is able to heal a patient, heal their body. All right, and so the word salvation, it's the same word. You can translate it as heal. When we're talking about salvation, we're not talking about just the healing of the body, though. We're talking about the healing of the whole person, the healing of the soul. So when Jesus came, and he says, it's in John 10:10, that he came so that those who follow him might have life and have it more abundantly. That's one way to think about that, is abundant life, is being healthy life, being full, healthy life. For the healthier a person is, the more that they can do, the more that they can enjoy what there's in front of them each and every day, this health that is mental and spiritual and physical. And so, as we read the Bible, we can read the Bible. This happens to be the Bible closest to me. We can read the Bible as the story of God and God's people, and how time and again God is working towards salvation. God is working towards the people being saved. And this salvation is being a healing of the people, getting them to be more healthy. The Bible is the story, you could think of it as the physical therapy, but the physical therapy of the soul, the mending of the people who are called to be God's people. And there is a lot to mend. There is a lot that needs to be healed. As you start going through and you just go back to the beginning, and go back to moments like Abraham in Genesis 22, when he is called to sacrifice his son, his only son, Isaac. And he takes Isaac to the Mount Moriah, and he has the knife up in the air, and he is ready to kill his son, and the angel calls out and says, stop. And it's this moment where Abraham is healed of the assumption of the misunderstanding that God would desire human sacrifice. But how broken, right? How unhealthy is it that Abraham lived in a culture and a time where he was told to sacrifice a child, and he went, okay, I'll do that. Right? That was just part of how he thought, right? That's something that needed to be healed, needed to be changed, right? You flip a few pages past that, we come to the story of Joseph in Genesis 40 through the end of the book of Genesis. And Joseph comes from a family in which brothers fight. Cain and Abel, Jacob, Esau, then Joseph and his brothers. And Joseph has to be healed of the grudge that he has. He has to learn to forgive, because unless he is healed of this grudge, unless he is healed of this anger, his family will die. And I'm not talking about in the abstract, sort of like they'll die as a family, that they won't be able to get together for the holidays. No, they'll die. Like they're in a time of famine, and if Joseph doesn't forgive his brothers, they will not receive grain, and they'll die of lack of food, of starvation, right? And that's an amazing thing to have to be healed of. And how broken and unhealthy is it that a family had to learn to not let other members of the family suffer over a grudge. Flip further, a few more pages in, we get to the book of Judges. And the book of Judges is this time when the Hebrews get the leaders that they deserve, because they get the leaders that they have raised up from amongst themselves, until by the end of the book of Judges, the best leader that can be found is Samson, a man ruled by his appetites, by his passions, someone who is seemingly incapable of self-control. And how broken and unhealthy is it that Samson is the best leader that can be found? Flip forward to the history of the kings of Israel, we find David. And David has to learn that what is good for the goose is good for the gander, otherwise known as when the king disrespects and breaks another man's family, another person's family, that he will break his own family, and that the rules, the laws, the wisdom, they apply to the king just as much as to anyone else. And just think about how broken and unhealthy it is that a community had a leader who lied. If you flip forward then to the prophet Amos, we can stop there and we can see the critique of the prophet Amos about how when a community shapes its economy such that in a time of plenty there are those who starve, that is evil. How broken and unhealthy is it to have a community where people starve while others feast? These lessons, these things that need to be healed amongst the Hebrew people, that leaders that lie, that economies that leave people behind such that they starve, that we get the leaders that we raise up, like that's all ancient, and that's all very modern, isn't it? All of that is what we grapple with today. Just like you can't skip any step of the physical therapy, right? I think we got to have the whole of the Bible's physical therapy for the soul, right? So that when Jesus shows up and he says that he fulfills the law and the prophets, right? That we know what he's talking about. Like, what does he fulfill in the law and the prophets? He fulfills all these lessons, all these stories, all the brokenness I've just laid out that needs to be healed in the Hebrew people. They're just people. And we're just people today, and they were just people in Jesus' day. And what needs to be healed doesn't change. And so when we read the law and the prophets, when Jesus says he comes to fulfill them, we're able to say, yes, this is what Jesus is fulfilling. He's leading people towards salvation, towards healing, as sort of laid out by the law, the wisdom, the prophets, the passions of what God desires. And so we can see that, like when Jesus says something like, love your enemy, love your neighbor, right? We can say turn the other cheek, right? We can see that is not something out of the blue, right? You go back to the Ten Commandments and it says, do not murder. Like that's the way you start with love your enemy, right? Love your neighbors. Don't kill your neighbor. That's a good place to start. That's what needs to be healed, is the desire to murder so as to get our own way. And then from do not murder, the next step is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, right? If you don't kill your neighbor, let's get to the next step, which is if you want to take revenge, it's not an eye for a family. If someone costs you an eye, you can't kill everyone in their family. So keep your revenge limited, so to speak, right? And then that's what sets the line so that we can say, do not murder, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, then to love your neighbor. And that, as Jesus says, and then finally, we hear, turn the other cheek, right? But there's a line of thought there that's the fulfillment that Jesus talks about fulfilling. That's what we see. And but that we need that whole line of thought. We need to go all the way back to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because we need, as I said, the full course of therapy. The problems, the things that were broken and unhealthy in the patriarchs, we're still struggling the same things today, right? To know what it is that Jesus fulfills, we have to know the Old Testament. We need Jesus, right? We have to have Jesus. We need Jesus, but we need everything that gets us to Jesus to understand what it is that Jesus is doing. Because Jesus without the Old Testament just doesn't make a lot of sense, right? The Old Testament tells us of the community, the 12 tribes that gather, such that there's someone to pay attention to Jesus. Without the Old Testament, we don't see the people that, as they learn over time, as they are healed of their false understanding of how they have gods, that they go from what's called henotheism, polytheism, there are many gods. Henotheism, my God is the true God among many gods, until we get to monotheism, which is that there is only one God. Until then we can see Jesus show up and know that God is understood as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Like, there's a line of thought there, but we got to have Old Testament to be able to understand that, because we are still tempted to idolatry in many ways today, right? Without the Old Testament, we don't have the prophets. And so Jesus' focus on those in need seems random without the call of the prophets of Jeremiah, of Isaiah, of Amos to be able to tell us what it is that God is passionate about, the deep-seated commitment. Without the Old Testament, when Jesus says the year of the Lord's favor has come, like that sounds like a nice platitude, and it doesn't. We need Leviticus. It's Leviticus 25 to tell us what God's economic plan is. It's called the year of the Lord's favor, the year of Jubilee, the forgiveness of debts, right? We got to have the Old Testament to understand what it is that Jesus keeps on pointing back towards, so that we can know where he is going next. Without the sacrificial system as experienced and explained by the Jewish people in the Old Testament, the cross just doesn't make sense. Right? Without the Old Testament to help us understand what sacrifice means, the cross is a bunch of Jews killing another Jew, and so what, right? But with the Old Testament, we can see how the cross works. We can understand Psalm 51 tells us, against you only, O Lord, we have sinned. So we can understand that sin is the breaking of relationship, and that when we sin against each other, we're sinning against God, because we're sinning against what God has desired and planned for us to be in a relationship with each other. And so that when a sacrifice is offered to restore a relationship, that it's not a sacrifice that is algebraic. Like as the sacrificial system is explained in the Old Testament, it is not like you do X much sin and then you have to make X much sacrifice to equal out X much sin. It's not algebraic, it's relational. That we offer what matters most. We offer blood. We offer life. We offer the life in the Old Testament times, life of an animal. But in this moment, Jesus offers himself. And that this sacrifice is relational and restorative, because Jesus says, Father, forgive. And it's forgiveness that allows relationship to resume, right? The brokenness of sin is what breaks relationship. Jesus says, Father, forgive them. And that is, if you ever want to know, when were you saved? The answer is on the cross. When Jesus said, Father, forgive them, that's when that is offered. When we accept that salvation, that's a different question. But when were we saved? The answer is on a cross on a Friday, centuries ago. Put as directly as I can put it, without the Old Testament, what Jesus does is incoherent. And we need to understand what it is that Jesus is doing, for we need to understand and experience the good news that Jesus comes to bring to pass as he fulfills the Old Testament, the law, and the prophets. Now, having said that, I need to acknowledge, reading the Old Testament is hard. There has been an inclination to ditch the Old Testament for almost as long as there's been a church. If you go back, it's the year 144 AD that a dude named Marcion is born. And Marcion wants to ditch the Old Testament. Marcion is the guy who makes sort of the first attempt at putting together what we now call the Bible. This dude named Marcion is a leader in the church. And he says, we need to have part of Luke, not all of Luke, just part of Luke, the gospel according to Luke, and we'll take 10 of the letters of Paul, and we're going to ditch the rest. And his first attempt at the Bible was a lot shorter. And in response, the leaders of the church, the bishops, got together and said, nah, that's not how it's going to work. What the Bible is going to be is what the Jewish people understand to be the Bible, and then what we're going to add to that, we'll call it the New Testament, is there are three standards. For a book to be in the New Testament had to meet three standards. It had to be written in the first century, it had to be connected to a disciple of Jesus, and it had to be consistent with the other books that met the first two criteria. And so we don't end up with some sort of wackadoodle sort of claims to try, because there were people who would write books and they would claim to be in the name of someone to try to exert control. It's a fascinating story, not for this sermon. But they put together the Bible in response to Marcion and his desire to ditch the Old Testament. And Marcion's beef with the Old Testament is the same thing that we hear today. The Old Testament, the God as portrayed in the Old Testament is mean. He's angry. I want to follow Jesus, not this angry God of the Old Testament. And that's something he said back then. That's something we hear today. And I have a response. And the question I would ask you is, were your parents fun before you were born? All right. Think about that for a minute. Were your parents fun before you were born? The answer is yes. But how long did it take for you to know that? All right, when you are 4, 6, 12, right? You don't know that your parents were ever fun. When is it that sinks in? Right? That your parents had fun before you were born, and they were capable of having fun. That was true consistently. They were capable of having fun. But at some point along the way, you realize, my parents, they had fun before me, and they're capable of having fun without me, right? Their ability to have fun is consistent. When we realize that as children, that happens later in time as we grow in our knowing. And so this is how I think we understand the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it is the story of God and God's people. And as God's people are writing their experiences of being God's people, they can only write what they understand. And so if you had 6-year-old Andy write about his parents, 6-year-old Andy would not be able to write about his parents as being capable of having fun. He could only write what he understood, what he knew. As you grow up, you know more and you understand more. As we read the Old Testament, it isn't that God has changed, it's that the understanding of God grows as you go through the Old Testament, which covers centuries. I think it is important to understand. The Old Testament covers centuries and centuries and centuries, right? And so we understand that God is most fully known in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And if we're going to read the Bible well, that means we start with Jesus. Practically, that's where we start. We start with Jesus. And we soak and marinate in the Gospels until we know what Jesus feels like and tastes like and looks like, and we know what is of Jesus. And we get that sense. And then from there, we can start moving out into the other parts of the Bible. Now that we've known God's the same today, yesterday, forever, right? That we know that God is revealed in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Once we understand that and that sinks in, we know what feels like Jesus, we can go into the Old Testament. And we're going to find places in the Old Testament that point directly to Jesus. The suffering servant narrative in Isaiah, that someone will suffer for the good of the people. That's Jesus. I can see that there it is, right? We can look at other parts of the Old Testament and go, no, that's not of God. That doesn't feel like Jesus. That is, they were still learning. They misunderstood that. They got that wrong. Because it's not that my parents stopped being fun for a time period. It's that I couldn't understand. It's not that God stopped being good. It's that God's people didn't understand, and the understanding developed over time. And as we read through the Old Testament, it will be a mix. You read the book of Jonah. The book of Jonah is a fascinating example of this, because the book of Jonah tells a story of a guy who firmly understands that if he goes to Nineveh, He will proclaim that if the people turn to God, God will forgive them. All right, this is of Jesus. Right? This is good. This is wonderful. Turn to God. God will forgive. This strikes me of being consonant, as being in line with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, who says, Father, forgive them. But this is also the story of Jonah is, the story of a guy who runs because he does not want them to be forgiven. And ain't that the truth? I'm sure everyone has had someone who they just don't want to be forgiven because they just don't want to deal with them. Maybe you're a better person than me. But I got to tell you, there are times that Jonah and I, we need the whole of the Old Testament because we need all the physical therapy of the soul that the Old Testament shows us, all the ways that need to be healed that are then come to fulfillment, right? If Jesus shows us what is healthy and true and good and 100% of everything that needs to be, we also need all the steps that get us to Jesus because we're not there yet. And we need to learn the lessons and be healed of all the things that the Jewish people needed to be grappled with and be healed of. Because people are people. We all need that. Once we know Jesus, once we have soaked in the Gospels, then we go read the rest. And we need the rest. We need to read the Old Testament, but always read it in light of Jesus. And I promise you that the more that you read the Old Testament, the more that you read it, having soaked in the Gospels and marinated in that, the more it will become clear that it's not really much an Old and a New Testament, but one testament, one story of God working for the salvation, the healing of all of God's people. A story that we are invited to become part of, and in doing so, to find our healing, our salvation. Amen.